Yeah.
I know you said beforehand, before we were recording, you're not the best on years and everything like that, but can you recall like a
When
vague time on when the majority of wrestlers in a given locker room were less interested in working on their characters and portraying them on TV and more interested in chasing a star rating? Do you remember more or less when that shift
when
happened?
that shifted,
Yeah.
yeah, it would be slightly after the Attitude Era ended. It had already begun prior to that. I really, because we had talked about this last night, the turning point in wrestling kind of was I use as a guidepost is kind of WrestleMania 3. Uh, one, the what we had discussed just a moment ago about how difficult it was to be a professional wrestler, and how closed the door was. Uh, that changed, and it changed. Quite honestly, the most prominent change was the Monster Factory in New Jersey with Larry Sharp. I'm not, Larry literally kind of opened the doors, was like, "Hey, you got the money, I'll train you," type of thing. Where before it was like, you had to fight, and I mean, genuinely had to fight and crawl and beg and plead to get somebody to be willing to do it. He was, here we go. And, he was fortunate because wrestling was so hot and he was right across the river from the center of the media universe in New York. So he got a lot of mainstream publicity, which helped to drive a lot of business, for his training facility. And so you understand, like, training facilities for wrestling were not prolific back then. Vern had Vern Gagne, the wrestling promoter in Minneapolis. He had a ring in his barn. I remember going down for a tryout with Ole and Gene Anderson, and they would, if you made it through the tryout, the way they trained you was they took you to the local YMCA where there was pads, to teach you how to wrestle.
How much did they
Because so,
charge you, by the way? I have to ask. How much did Ollie and Gene
uh,
charge you?
it was 500, $250 for the tryout.
Mhm.
Um, and so, uh, uh, so there was not a proliferation of schools. Then they weren't very prolific. Kowalski had one, and he was just about the only one that had a full time school, other than Larry Sharp when he had opened the Monster Factory. So that door got blown wide open to the point where Larry was going around selling franchises to other wrestlers of the Monster Factory. I remember Charlie Fulton and Marion, Ohio bought into a franchise of the Monster Factory. And so that changed dramatically, and to this day, it is far too easy to gain entrance into the wrestling business. The way I ended up buying OVW was because I met one of my partners, Chad Miller, a great guy, and was on the executive director of the Kentucky Boxing Wrestling Commission. The way I met him was earlier that year, a young guy out in Oklahoma had died from an injury he'd suffered in the ring. He had gotten a spine buster and hit his head and had went into a coma. And this was not the first guy this had happened. And I got to thinking about it, and seated in a lot of independent around the world, not just in the United States, around the world. Okay, a lot of independent wrestling locker rooms, looking around the locker room, and one, no ifs, ands, or buts. This is an aesthetic, cosmetic business, and meaning that when you walk through that curtain, physically, visually, you better be able to convey to an audience an ability to believe that you can whip somebody's ass, that you make your living in a competitive combat situation. Well, let's face it, there are a lot of people that are in this business right now that do not even remotely look like that. Okay. But I get it. That's fine. I'm not judging as far as a physical appearance, but again, let's make no mistake. This is a physical appearance business. Okay. It's not, I didn't make it that way. So you can sit there and moan and bitch about, oh, you'd be victim about, oh, he's body shaming. No, I'm not. That's how it works. I didn't make the rules. You know, I don't care how you look. Here's my problem. My problem is that you're physically in no actual real condition to safely and respectably go in the ring and perform on a level that allows you to protect yourself and your opponent. That's my issue. That's my problem. Because regardless of what you might think as far as, oh, wrestling's fake, it is still very much a very intense athletic endeavor that you're going out and performing. And now you're going to do it. And in about 8 minutes, you're going to want to try to do that cool spot you saw recently on your New Japan video, or this fantasy of this spot you saw the Usos and Roman Reigns do on Raw. And you're going to want to do it. And you're too blown up to safely and effectively do it. And one of you might potentially, again, back when we had the conversation about Darren Drozdov, suffer a life-altering or life-ending injury. Okay.
Mm.
And it's insulting that you think that you can come in and you can be a part of this profession, because the first part of professional is profession. Okay. And then you don't have to genuinely invest any time, money, or effort into yourself, but you're somehow unrealistically expecting that, number one, a promoter is going to do that with you. And number two, that the fans, the audience, which is really the biggest sin, are investing their time, money, and effort to see you and get a certain experience that you can't offer them because you don't even invest the time, money, and effort in yourself. You don't go to a gym. Hell, you don't even know a guy named Jim, you know? And so it was insulting. And then when I really got to thinking about it, because in the United States, we have numerous vocations that or require a license to perform. If you're a beautician, you're a barber. My wife is a licensed masseuse, okay, but if you even want to be a mortician, you have to have a license. In order to acquire those licenses and those other licensed vocations, you have to let's lay it out. You've got to go to a state accredited training facility for, even if you just want to cut hair, all right, or you want to work on dead people. And what's the risk of you injuring a dead person? Who cares? They're dead. All right. You got to go to a state accredited school, be taught by a state accredited approved teacher who has a certain level of experience and understanding of the information they're disseminating. You have to complete a certain number of state required hours. You have to then complete a certain number of resident hours, meaning you have actual hands-on experience performing the work. And then and only then do you get to take a test to get a license to pursue that vocation. In professional wrestling within the United States, we've got numerous athletic commissions, one in Missouri, one in Louisiana, one in Kentucky, one in Maryland. We got them all over the country. The requirement for you to be a licensed professional wrestler is, in most states, you just take a physical and then you pay your money. You're done. That's it. There are no standards. There's no, way to, and now within the wrestling business itself, there are no standards. Okay. And I'll get to the other part of the question here in just a second, because this does it has a certain amount of gravity to it.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of whether people want to agree with me or not, I genuinely don't care. Everything I'm stating is based off of facts. You are going to go in and try to pursue a vocation that clearly is an athletic endeavor that requires a certain level of athletic, not just physical fitness, but athletic fitness. Okay. You need to have the proper training and understanding of the skills that you've acquired and how to best utilize them, not just to elicit an emotional reaction, but to physically protect yourself and your opponent at all times while you're in that ring performing, to mitigate the always present risk of you suffering some horrific injury. It's a fact. That's reality. And you don't. Anyone with any level of experience can open up a wrestling school. And let's face it, in the UK and here in the United States, tons.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions, there are thousands of them. and anyone could do it in any building as long as they got a building, they put a ring in it, and then there's no set amount of training that has to be done, and that's leading to the degradation of the wrestling business. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Let's not even get into the fact that you're not being really taught the real skills of how to genuinely perform the art of how to work a wrestling match. Hell, most of them don't even know what the definition of the term work is anymore. Because I hear them all the time go, oh, that guy's a really great worker. So-and-so's a really great worker. Why are they a great worker? Well, they can do stuff. They can go. That's not a worker. That's an athlete. That's a performer. The difference between an athlete, a performer, and a worker is this. A worker is someone, because a term of work, so we are clear, a term of work is a con, a sham. It is to make someone believe a lie, something that's not real. There is only, no ifs, ands, or buts, there is only one thing that is not real, that is a lie in wrestling. And that is that outcome we already know before we walk in that ring. So my work is to convince you that my intent from the moment I walk through that curtain is to attempt to win. And your ability to believe in me, who I am, and the fact that I'm out there constantly trying to do that and not lose because of the consequence of it, that's what you're paying to believe in, not in the moves. Okay. And that's where that evaluation of, well, Hulk Hogan, he wasn't a great worker, he wasn't a great wrestler. Bullshit. He was fantastic because you paid your money. You could, for the moment you walked in that building, believe in Hulk Hogan and believe in what he was attempting to do. And if people can say what they want, but the facts state themselves. If you couldn't have done that, there wouldn't have been thousands of people on top of thousands of people that would have paid to see him. It wouldn't have been a Saturday night's main event on a mainstream broadcast network in the United States. There wouldn't have been movies that he were in. Granted, most of them were terrible, but
I was going to say, how could you say Three Ninjas at Mega Mountain was not Oscar worthy?
I know, yeah, it was really spectacular. What a piece of celluloid art. But let's face it. I mean, he was great at what he did. And we have those standards. So that WrestleMania 3, that started to change. Okay. And the entrance into the building, into the wrestling business, just the doors are still to this day wide open. And again, are degrading the business itself. One time, getting into the wrestling business, like I had mentioned before, was, it was easier to be a man than mafia. And it was kind of like the NFL or an elite soccer club in, Britain. Like, not just anybody can walk on the field and just do it. Well, now, I always reference this monster.com commercial that really epitomizes professional wrestling. You're watching two tennis players. They're at the top of their game and they're playing this game of tennis. It's spectacular. They're volleying back and forth. And then all of a sudden, two people are on the court with them and it becomes like a doubles game. You're like, what's going on? Now, two more people. Now the game gets completely fucked. And then the camera pulls back and you see people in the stands all running and getting down on the court. And that essentially is what happened to wrestling. All of the people that were in the stands now have a means of egress to go right out of the stands over the rail and they get into the ring. And in the wrestling business has suffered for it. And that changed at WrestleMania 3. Now, where it also changed was for another reason, and that was at that point, the war was kind of over. The war of where Vince supposedly destroyed the territories. And Vince didn't go out and destroy the territories. What Vince did was Vince basically gave all of the workers that were in those territories a greater opportunity with a greater platform to make more money. And they all jumped at it and they all left. There was a mass exodus of workers from the territories to Vince. And as such, all of those territories now were bereft of workers. And there is a distinct difference between a worker and a wrestler. Okay. There had always been the saying in the wrestling business that, wrestlers don't make money because they don't. And you can put a pair of trunks and a pair of boots on anybody, put them in the ring, and they call themselves a wrestler. And let's face it, we see examples of that all the time on independent shows to this day. Yeah. But a worker, someone, because it's the old, hey, anybody can paint a house, but not everybody can paint a picture. There's a big difference. Anybody can do a paint by numbers painting. Not everyone can do a painting that sits in a museum that evokes an emotional response just by viewing it. That takes an artist. So everybody can be a painter, not everybody can be an artist. And everybody can be a wrestler, not everybody can be a worker. So no workers. The dismantling of the territories, which were where wrestlers could, wrestlers could go and make a living, started to dissolve. And so people that were now making their way into the wrestling business, if you weren't already in the door, it was going to really start to become more of a challenge for you to really make wrestling, be in the real wrestling business, have this as your vocation. You're going to become, a guy who works another, which there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to become a guy that works another job, but you're going to pursue your wrestling only on the weekends. But it's not your sole means of income. It's not your sole means of survival. So your mindset's going to be completely different. It's not going to be the same. No question. That shifted. So now the onus wasn't on, because, I'd been in the business, I tell guys all the time, 12, 14 years. I'd walk back from my match. No one ever asked me, hey, how was your match? Didn't care. That question never came up. Number one question was always asked is, what's the house? How many people are out there? What's it look like, kid? That was all they cared about, because that meant the more people that were out there, the more money they ate, the more they could support their family, the more they could eat, they could feed themselves. And that was why nobody ever asked how good somebody's match was, because they knew that if you were on the show, people trusted you and that you could deliver, and otherwise you wouldn't even have been on the card. It was not a question of how good it was, and but then that shifted, that changed, because now the onus was no longer on, hey, I need to do this to survive. It was now, I do this and I enjoy it, and it's a dream. And you know look, I work Monday through Friday, and I do this on Friday night and Saturday night and occasionally Sunday. you know so now it's now all about, it started out because WrestleMania 3 was the place where it really, we had this conversation last night. You know, I pointed out, and the only reason I pointed it out is because I saw the influence of on the wrestlers within the business, because no matter what anybody thinks or says, the wrestling business has and will always be the wrestler's business. It's not Vince's, it's not a promoter's, it's not a writer's, it's the wrestlers. So if you're watching Raw and it sucks, that's because the wrestlers ain't doing what they're supposed to do. Period. Once they walk through that curtain, there's nothing you can do to help them, and there's nothing you can do to hinder them. They are completely responsible for you being entertained and retaining your attention. So, uh, um, they can make, promoters and writers can make it more difficult for a wrestler to, accomplish their goals, but doesn't make it impossible. Um,